Hello, everyone. Once again, this is Pastor Terry Reese of the Valley Grace Brethren Church of Armagh, Pennsylvania. Once again, we're coming to you from beautiful Flood City, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and we're delighted and honored that you could join us here on the broadcast. And we are continuing our series on modern gender dysphoria, and we're talking about really, we're offering a ninefold biblical response to this issue. Perhaps this is something you would rather not hear about. Perhaps it's something you would rather not even think about. But nonetheless, it is a highly relevant topic. It is something that has been thrust in our faces by the cultural elites. And it's something that the Church of God needs to have some answers with regard to. We're going to give you a ninefold response rooted in the Scriptures with regard to this modern transgender movement. I do want to, this week, however, supply a little more background material. I had not planned to do so, but some other information has come before us that we think you should be privy to. This trans movement is global in nature, but nonetheless, right now the political epicenter is the United States. Right now it is kind of the hot button issue. It's become the cause célèbre of recent years, something everyone's talking about. It's become the big civil rights issue of our time. We're told that trans and also gay, LGBTQ, that this is the new black, meaning it is the big civil rights topic that's being pushed today. And, this... as I said, this is a global movement, as I've said before, but again, the political epicenter, the center of the storm, the eye of the hurricane is right here in the United States. In the past, other nations were deemed to be ahead of the United States in these things. The Scandinavian countries, where you had some of the early procedures. Also, Great Britain, whose thinking was considered very advanced in this topic. And yet, in these countries, you've seen somewhat of a pushback with regard to some of these topics, particularly within the medical community. And also, you've seen somewhat of a rollback of public support in some of these European countries. They've experienced some of the perils related to this movement, and in some areas they're starting to back off in their promotion of these things. For example, you might have noticed a couple weeks ago, the British Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, came out making some comments affirming that there are only two genders. He was very pronounced in this, Britain's new conservative prime minister, and he made it very clear that a man cannot become a woman. Can you imagine our current president making such an address? But I think the boldness of his remarks somewhat reflects changing attitudes in Great Britain. Also, recently in Sweden, a new study came out, which stated that post-op trans people have a disproportionately higher suicide rate than do the general population, and also disproportionately higher psychological problems than do the general population. It's very interesting that Sweden, one of these so-called advanced countries with very liberal views on this topic, that Sweden has come out with this rather disquieting report, even as the United States and the medical establishment here has neglected across the board peer-reviewed studies on this issue. We'll get into that a little deeper. I think it's very shameful, and it's also very enlightening that the medical establishment in this country has been extraordinarily neglectful in addressing this topic and doing long-term studies, underlining the potential perils associated with these dangerous procedures. At this point, I want to stop at this point and alert you to the fact that there is a wonderful, wonderful interview out there that just appeared on the airwaves in the last couple weeks, I think within the last 2 weeks or so. Tucker Carlson on Twitter interviewed a man named Chris Moritz, that's spelled Moritz, on Twitter, or X as it's now referred to. And this interview, I think it's around 48 minutes in length. It's quite extraordinary. It's quite jaw-dropping in terms of the facts that are uncovered here. This interview relates to the fact that the trans movement in this country, that these procedures have become big business, that people are getting rich exploiting these sad, disturbed people, making a lot of money off of them. And Chris Moritz underlines the financial aspects of these things in his interview with Tucker. And he gives you a bit of a history of where this country's medical establishment has been on this issue over the last couple decades. And some very enlightening facts have come out. He talks about how really Obamacare was really kind of the catalyst that saw the explosion of various procedures and therapies in this regard in this country. By the way, that I highly recommend you watching this Chris Moritz interview. If you don't have Twitter, it's also on YouTube, the entire interview. But Chris Moritz talks about how Obamacare really is what opened the door in terms of these procedures being practiced on a mass scale. Of course, in 2010, you have Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, as it was misnamed, came into existence. But quietly written into Obamacare was the requirement that insurance companies provide for necessary, quote, gender-affirming care, unquote. So there you see the government coming into this. These procedures are, of course, very expensive. I think the figures given for male to female gender reassignment, you're talking, probably around $150,000, perhaps more. If you look at the history on this, once the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, required insurance companies to get involved in this, you saw a 50% increase in sexual reassignment surgeries in the period from 2010 to 2016. Then, in 2016, an additional amendment, we're still dealing with the Obama administration, was added to the Affordable Care Act. This amendment stipulated that gender identity could no longer be a basis for the denial of coverage by private insurance companies. And as a result of that amendment, in the period from 2016 to 2017, we saw a 150% increase in gender reassignment procedures and surgeries. It's quite astonishing, and obviously there's a direct correlation between what the government was doing and the numbers of related medical procedures that came out of this. Now, these things were revoked by Donald Trump when he became president, but then they were reinstated by Joe Biden in his first 100 days in the White House in 2021. So you see, friends, it does matter who sits in the Oval Office. The person who sits in the Oval Office has an enormous amount of power. And today, of course, with executive actions, the power of the presidency is quite astonishing. Today's imperial presidency. So it does matter who you vote for, and as I've said before, one of the big scandals in terms of modern evangelicalism is that millions of purported evangelicals don't even bother to vote, even in times such as these. Now, when you think about that, though, I think about Barack Obama. It's quite astonishing when you consider the influence that one man had upon the culture. One man being elevated to the presidency, the influence and the impact that one man had upon LGBTQ-related issues. And of course, that influence was entirely wicked and unbiblical. But, here you have a man who set aside the don't ask, don't tell policy, and a man who stopped enforcing and challenged the constitutionality of DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act that was passed by Congress during the Clinton years. This, of course, ultimately led to the United States Supreme Court striking down all these state laws against gay marriage, and thus mandating that gay marriage would be a reality embraced throughout the United States, thereby corrupting the entire culture. I mean, friends, it's quite breathtaking to consider how the elevation of one man to the presidency in 2008 changed everything. Now, I'm not blaming it all on Mr. Obama, of course. The culture was more than ready, apparently, to follow him in this. We don't lay it all on Barack. But nonetheless, you consider this, especially in light of what we've been hearing over this past year. In 2017, a book was written by a journalist named David Garrow entitled Rising Star. It was a biography of Barack Obama, and Mr. Garrow is not a conservative. Actually, he's someone who likes Mr. Obama politically. But in that book, published again in 2017, and which did not make much impact, in that book, Mr. Garrow revealed a 1982 letter that was written by a 21-year-old college student named Barack Obama, which had escaped public notice. Now, for some reason, this book, written in 2017, these revelations did not make much of an impact, but for some reason this year, in 2023, everyone's talking about it. But in this book, it relates the text of this handwritten letter by Barack Obama to his then girlfriend, a young lady named Alex McNear. This letter is now in the custody of Emory University. Okay, this is something real. It's not some National Enquirer thing. But the text of this letter, written in Obama's own hand, he states that he regularly fantasized about having sex with other men. In other words, he confesses to being a bisexual. And he then goes on to speak of his own personal gender identity confusion. That he speaks of himself as being androgynous, having both male and female characteristics in terms of his own gender identity. However, he goes on to say, I nonetheless accept the biological reality that I was born in a man's body, and so I go with that. But I bring this up not to be scurrilous or scandalous or anything like that, but just to underline the fact that, when you elect a person, and of course none of us knew in 2008 this is where he had stood, but when you elect a person who has these who's struggling with his own gender identity related issues and his own confused sexuality, which perhaps is rooted back in his own disturbing upbringing and his mentorship under Frank Marshall Davis. When you elect someone to such a high office, you make him the king. You see how the entire culture ends up being disfigured. Friends, it is very, very, very important that you be aware of who these people are and exactly where they stand, and you exercise your civic responsibility to act as an informed citizen. Well, having said that, I just want to look at some of the numbers here. The last couple of messages I've spoken of how this trans community is a comparative statistical sliver of the population, and indeed it is. And yet, I don't think we can any longer simply refer to it as a mere fad. The actual numbers of trans people are in fact rising, and indeed rising rapidly. And I think a lot of this is the result of the general drift of the culture. Overall, from ages 13 on up through adulthood, we're told that there are 1.6 million trans people now living in the United States of America. Now, considering the fact that our overall population is 350 million people, that is a sliver of the population, but nonetheless, it is a rising sliver, and it's a fair amount of people, 1.6 million. This number has doubled over the course of a decade. Back in 2011, there were only 700,000 self-identified trans people here in the United States. So that's a doubling over 10 years. With regard to youth from ages 13 to 17, it's claimed that there are now some 300,000 self-identified trans youth in the United States. That's a 2022 statistic. And that number has doubled in 5 years. In 2017, there was 150,000. So that's a total doubling in just 5 years in terms of youth from ages 13 to 17. I think that, by the way, does lend credence to the argument that this is something cultural in large measure, rather than something that is inborn. No scientist, by the way, has found a trans gene or anything like this. Just the fact that you see a doubling of the statistic in only 5 years, I find that very interesting, and it kind of argues against the idea of a biological component or a physiological component. Clinics providing treatment for such trans children in the last 15 years have skyrocketed. 15 years ago, there were no clinics, zero, in this country dedicated to this, towards the treatment of so-called trans children. Today, there's around 100 such clinics that are open to this, to providing various therapies and treatments for trans children who wish to transition. Again, that is an alarming level of growth. Now, I want to right off the bat say this. The real enemy here is not these emotionally, psychologically, socially, spiritually disturbed people. I'm not here to beat up on people who are suffering spiritually and emotionally and psychologically. I see these people as victims of this culture, particularly the young people. They've fallen under bad influence, and it is our hope that these people's lives will be salvaged, that by the power of the Holy Spirit they'll be able to break out of this dysphoria that they're experiencing, and that they might come to the Lord Jesus Christ and be saved while he may yet be found, and he's able to heal them of their dysphorias. So I'm not here to brutalize or beat up on people that are suffering. My focus is more on those who are exploiting these unfortunate people who are struggling with their sin. I'm speaking, as always, of the empowered, culture-dominating, agenda-driven, progressive elites, the establishment elites who control this culture, its power centers, the political power centers, the academic power centers, etc., the entertainment industry. These are the people that we are locked in a culture war with that has many, many fronts. But even beyond them, even beyond the empowered elites, who are true villains in this piece, stand invisible, spiritual, dark forces in high places. The real ultimate enemy, the devil and his angels. Of course, Ephesians 6:12 tells us that is the identity of the true enemy. We do not fight against flesh and blood ultimately, but against these spiritual forces. Of course, it is for these spiritual forces, the devil and his angels, that eternal hell was originally designed, according to our Lord in Matthew 25:41. Tragically, they are seducing many human beings. It will be their destiny to join them. The political agenda of such empowered establishment elites is seen, I think, in the skirting of various medical and scientific standards with regard to this issue in order to promote their ideology. I want to give you some relative facts along these lines where you can see how these scientific and medical standards have been set aside in the name of a political agenda. First of all, we speak of this transgenderism today in accordance with queer theory as though it is something normal, just as normal as cisgenderism. But the fact is, there is no scientific basis in terms of the physiology of this condition. There is no trans gene that anyone's been able to isolate. Whether or not some such individuals may in some cases suffer from some form of organic brain dysfunction, I don't know, and I don't know that science has proven that. We see no evidence of that, but even if such a condition exists, that is a result of the fall. It's not something normal. It's not something healthy. It's not something to be cultivated. Second of all, here's something that is quite shocking. And again, I want to refer you to the Chris Moritz interview on Tucker. There are listen to this, no clinical studies in this country on the long-term effects or consequences or potentially debilitating effects of these gender reassignment procedures on patients. I'm saying none. None. This is extraordinary. You're seeing patients, including children, being pumped up with powerful drugs in preparation for such procedures. I'm talking about testosterone, estrogen, puberty blockers, very powerful drugs with no attending studies with regard to the long-term effects. That in and of itself is remarkable. And does that not speak of how the political agenda, not the science, is driving this thing? What the real motives are in terms of those who are pushing this thing. I mean, can you think of any other branch of medicine where these kind of powerful drugs and these extraordinary surgical procedures are being promoted, pushed, without the attending long-term peer-reviewed studies? It's unheard of. And yet here it's being pushed, normalized, because of a political agenda. A political agenda that apparently is more important than people's lives. You know, some of these drugs could have remarkable effects, especially on children. I'm thinking especially of these powerful puberty blockers, which could have long-term effects on brain development, on even things such as bone density, all these things. And yet the FDA, now listen to this, has not approved a single pharma product for use, any of these products, for use in gender transition, that is specifically to be used for that purpose. Now, some of these drugs are used in cancer therapy and have been approved for that purpose, but not for gender reassignment purposes. And yet, these drugs, these powerful drugs, the testosterone, the estrogen, and the puberty blockers are being pumped into people, including children, minors who are still developing, and they're being prescribed off-label. That is, they are unauthorized. And yet, it's being done. Why? Because it's politically correct to do it. Because it satisfies the demands of a certain political agenda. And again, that trumps the health and well-being of these unfortunate people who are being exploited by the empowered elites. I think you can see what I mean by this. They have no compassion for these people, despite claiming that we stand with the trans kids. And yet, here they are, threatening their very lives with these kind of untested procedures. Where else is this allowed in medicine? Once again, I ask. It's interesting that the only protocols that anyone seems to be following, whether it be the public school counselors and the various health care systems and guidance counselors, whatever, the only protocols that anyone seems to be following all come from a group called WPATH, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, which is a trans advocacy group, an agenda-driven group that seeks to promote these things. It's not some impartial medical overview board or anything like this. By the way, this group recently, we see, fired its own leader for publicly questioning the speed in which we're moving in promoting these therapies, that is, going ahead of the science. This is a fanatical organization, in other words, and yet they are establishing all the protocols that all the so-called experts are following. This is why, friends, I always say we should be very cautious about giving absolute authority to the professionals, to the so-called scientists. We need to be questioning science today because, let's face it, science today is not based simply upon objective empirical research and the scientific method. So much of science today is, shall we say, political in nature, ideological in nature. And, by the way, this goes back even to the 19th century. You see Darwinism promoted for sheer ideological reasons. No one has ever proven Darwinism, the origin of new species in a lab, not back in the 1800s and not today. And yet it is accepted for philosophical, ideological reasons. So we need to be cautious in just blindly following the people in the white coats. Where are the doctors in this country, the MDs? Where is the American Medical Association? The sad truth is, the professional medical establishment in this country has largely been silent. And of course, we know why that is, don't we? Everybody wants to be politically correct today, and that trumps the science, whether you're dealing with climate change or LGBTQ issues. The political agenda, once again, always trumps the science. So we see, again, that this entire thing is agenda-driven. We need to have our eyes open about this, that this is being pushed by postmodern cultural Marxists who are planning to change the culture and to annihilate the influence of the Christian faith. And that is our world. Just want to, before I wrap up here, in a previous message I talked about with regard to the LGBTQ issues, I talked about how marketing has been successfully employed with regard to some of these issues, mass brainwashing, using of commercial marketing tactics, all these things to manipulate public opinion. We talked about how nomenclature, what names things are called, has been successfully employed in the past. For example, to change our attitudes with regard to the homosexual community. For example, as I had observed in that previous message, at one time homosexuals were referred to as sodomites, which refers to an act, a sinful act, a potentially criminal act. Then it was changed to homosexual, which deals with a clinical condition, and that's something that garners a little more sympathy, a condition. Even if it's an abnormal condition, still it's a condition. And then the term was changed to gay, which deals not with a sin, an act, or not with a condition, an aberrant condition, but rather deals with an identity, a legitimate identity, which thus must be treated as something normal and something which must be tolerated and accepted. Likewise, with transsexualism, we see a changing of the nomenclature over the last few years. For most of the 20th century, transsexualism was seen as a psychiatric disorder, and it was treated as such. If you claim to have some sort of gender identity disorder, that it was seen as a disorder, something that was disordered, an abnormality, and a mental illness of some kind. As far as medical procedures to try to change someone's actual identity, gender reassignment, that was very rare. Yes, back in 1952, you had your first procedure of someone named Christine Jorgensen, but then, in some of the Scandinavian countries, they were more, shall we say, advanced in these things. But by and large, until a relatively brief period of time ago, these procedures were very rare. But then, you see, in 2013, the American Psychiatric Association amending its Diagnostic Statistic Manual, the so-called DSM. And in that manual, under the pressure of needing to be politically correct, the American Psychiatric Association no longer classified what it called then transsexualism as an objective psychosexual disorder. Previously, what was called transsexualism, you don't see that term so much anymore. It's because that's a politically incorrect term. It was called gender identity disorder. Note that was the term, gender identity disorder. It was classified as a disorder, a mental illness, an abnormality. But that had to go because, according to modern queer theory, which we talked about last time, a branch of critical theory, just like critical race theory is, according to modern queer theory, it is not a disorder. It is just as normal as cisgenderism. Cisgender means your biological body corresponds to your inward identity. You have a male body, and inwardly you feel that you're a male. That's cisgenderism. But now we're told that transgenderism is just as normal. That's what queer theory tells us. So no longer could it be called gender identity disorder, an objective psychosexual disorder. Now it had to be rebranded as gender dysphoria. Now, gender dysphoria, that is more of a subjective term. That relates to things like the stress that a transgender person feels in terms of being born in the, quote, wrong body, and also the societal pressure that he faces, that society treats him as though he or she is abnormal, even though they really aren't. That's what this new term, gender dysphoria, relates to. The idea that you feel stress at being born in the wrong body, and you feel stress with regard to the idea that society is against you. In other words, the condition itself is not a disorder. It's a matter of feelings, a matter of that which is subjective, dealing with a prejudicial society. So it's no longer gender identity disorder. It's now gender dysphoria. And they no longer favor terms like transsexualism or transvestitism. That's another term that is becoming politically incorrect. Now it's transgenderism. The the idea is that once again, everything in accordance with postmodern philosophy is subjective. And that these things should be seen as normal. And if you have a problem with it, well, the problem is with you. And that's where we are at then as a culture. Next week, I want to take up a ninefold biblical response to these things. I know I said last week that I was going to start that this week, but I did want to bring you that additional information, which I think is very enlightening as we navigate through this strange and awful time in which we're living. Well, friends, we look forward to seeing you next week, and until such time, this is Pastor Terry Reese. May the Lord be with you.